What is up, folks? My name is Chris, and I am your
NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at the 12-game Week 2 slate of the 2025 NFL season. And I'm happy to be back here this week because we actually have some information that we can use to make better decisions than we had last week, because we finally have some information on how these teams prefer to use their players in different offensive situations. We're going to dive right into it and talk about it here. If you're new to the channel, if you're a returning viewer, you know that I like to start by looking at the teams that are favored in betting markets, because that gives us the best chance to see which offenses are going to put their running backs in a position to succeed on Sunday. And I think that's a good way to start building our player pools for our lineups in DFS contests. The biggest favorite on Sunday afternoon is the Baltimore Ravens in their home opener against the Cleveland Browns. They are currently favored by 12.5 points. And that means King Henry, Derrick Henry himself, is going to be an extremely popular option in DFS contests. Going to be a little bit more popular over on FanDuel than on DraftKings with the looser salary cap structure, and probably a great low-risk play. Specifically on FanDuel is in play for DraftKings player pools as well, but projecting right now to be slightly more popular in FanDuel low risk. The Baltimore Ravens, top 3 run blocking offensive line in 2024. Browns, roughly league average defending the rush, roughly league average defending running backs in the passing game, for whatever that's worth when Henry gets his 1 to 2 targets. Henry has not had a tremendous amount of success against Cleveland, but there is a little bit of a narrative here going on with some Browns defenders basically saying publicly that they're not worried about Derrick Henry, saying that he's not difficult to tackle, and Henry's response basically being, well, we'll see how that goes on Sunday. So the narrative here might be in favor of Derrick Henry having a big day in the Ravens home opener, as the Ravens look to wash the bitter taste of last week's disappointing last-second loss to Buffalo out of their mouths here. But more on the Ravens in a little bit. The next biggest favorite are the Arizona Cardinals in their matchup with the Carolina Panthers this week. Arizona at home is favored by 6.5 points, and that means we can go right back to the well with James Conner, who had a pretty solid workload last week for Arizona on the road against the Saints. The Panthers were the worst rush defense in the NFL last year, and that was probably a reason we should have been more interested in the Jacksonville running backs last week. Now we can learn our lesson a little bit and take advantage of the matchup here in week number 2 and consider James Conner also was slightly below average defending running backs in the passing game, and with 4 targets in week 1 against the Saints, we can declare that Kyler Murray is going to continue to look James Conner's way in passing situations. So that does give him a little bit more upside here on DraftKings as well at a very modest cost of $6,600. Next biggest favorite. This is where I have to eat a little bit of crow. The Detroit Lions are favored by 6.5 points in their home opener against the Chicago Bears. And I was anticipating a Jahmyr Gibbs takeover in this backfield. We didn't really fully see that. We did see Gibbs out-snap David Montgomery roughly 2-1. There were 67 total offensive snaps last week. Gibbs played 44. Montgomery played 27. This was a game where the Lions were basically trailing by 3 scores for the majority of the game, and that's why Gibbs had a tremendous amount of targets, 10 receptions on 10 targets last week, and that could be why he played a hell of a lot more than David Montgomery did. We get a better neutral game script situation, and it does seem like David Montgomery has still retained his early down and rushing down role in this offense in key situations, and this could be the exact type of situation where that matters quite a bit. David Montgomery is going to be a game script dependent RB if this continues like it has for the last couple of years with the Lions. New offensive coordinator this year, and it does seem like David Montgomery still has a decent floor for touches in this offense. Bottom line, this week in low risk, no one's really playing either of these guys because this RB1A, 1B situation has emerged again here in 2025, but we get an opportunity to deploy both these guys in tournaments, and specifically at home, anticipating a positive game script. David Montgomery at a modest price might be a really good tournament play here, but not in play for low risk on DraftKings and FanDuel. Next biggest favorite, we have the Buffalo Bills favored by 6 points on the road against the New York Jets. Not really the greatest news this week to see that James Cook was on the injury report with a hamstring injury. Now, he was cleared. He doesn't have any status going into this game. He's going to play, probably see his normal allotment of snaps, but I'm not a big fan of seeing running backs having a hamstring / soft tissue injury issue throughout the week. So I think James Cook, very, very solidly high risk only despite Buffalo being a big favorite here against the Jets in week number 2. Final big favorite on the board, we have the Dallas Cowboys favored by 5.5 points at home against the New York Giants, and it is the Javonte Williams show in this backfield. 15 carries last week, a couple of rushing touchdowns. Did see Miles Sanders operate more as like a breather back and in some passing situations, but I do think Javonte Williams probably one of the better underpriced for his role running backs here going into a pretty favorable situation for Dallas in their home opener here in week 2 as well. Of all the running backs that I've discussed, though, only Derrick Henry is really projecting to be super popular this week. There's 3 running backs that I think are better suited for your lineups, and my favorite play of that group is Christian McCaffrey. Would have been featured in last week's video if we didn't have that midweek kind of injury report scare, and that ended up being overblown a little bit, guys, because the workload was incredible last week. You see 22 carries, 10 targets last week for San Francisco against the Seahawks on the road. Now facing the New Orleans Saints on the road, and in a situation where basically every other name brand 49er player is injured, it does seem like McCaffrey is going to get used quite heavily once again as San Francisco tries to get another game into the win column with Mac Jones under center here against the Saints. Saints were the second worst rush defense in the NFL last year, and they were league average defending running backs in the passing game. So McCaffrey has a really, really good chance to hit his ceiling here, and I think we'll get a floor of about 10 to 15 fantasy points at the absolute minimum. So I'm willing to play him for the upside. This is still an extremely cheap price for Christian McCaffrey of $7,500 here on DraftKings and $8,900 over on FanDuel, where I do think he's a great low-risk play as well. The Miami Dolphins are only 2.5 point favorites at home against the New England Patriots this week, and they looked really bad last week. No question about it. They looked horrible against the Colts in week number 1. But the player that had an encouraging amount of work in that game, the raw numbers, don't look great here. 7 carries, 4 targets. That's because Miami was barely on the field. Devin Achane dominated the opportunities at running back, and I do think that is a good thing that will continue to happen moving forward for Achane. Facing a Patriots defense that was the 5th worst defending running backs, both on the ground and through the air last year. Patriots are also dealing with some defensive injuries this week that might mitigate some of the offensive line issues that Miami has here. Bottom line, the field is all about Achane once again here in week number 2. And you see a game that probably couldn't have gone worse from a game script situation for Achane, with Miami down literally by 33 points. They didn't score that touchdown till the very end of the game. Still gave us 16.5 PPR points here on DraftKings. That's a floor I'll be willing to take week in and week out, especially if this price doesn't move that much. 6,900 here on DraftKings, 78 over on FanDuel. Achane also a really strong play for our low-risk lineups. Chase Brown had every single backfield touch for a running back in the Cincinnati offense last week against the Browns. Didn't have an efficient day on the ground at all, only 2 yards per carry, 43 yards on those 21 carries, but you get the 20 to 25 touch upside, playing 80% plus the snaps, getting basically 80% plus of team rush attempts. Chase Brown is going to be a staple of all lineups, low-risk lineups, especially if this is going to be what he sees week in and week out. Taj Brooks, not really any touches whatsoever. Samaje Perine did mix in a little bit in passing down situations, but bottom line, Chase Brown is the guy that we want here against Jacksonville for Cincinnati's home opener. The Jaguars were below average against the rush and below average defending running backs in the passing game. So for me, DraftKings and FanDuel, looking to get McCaffrey, Achane, and Chase Brown as the big 3 running backs into my lineups. The only other decision point that I do think really does make sense to consider on DraftKings is that Derrick Henry spot, priced up to $8,200 here on DraftKings. Significantly higher than McCaffrey, like $700 higher here on DraftKings. The price is a little closer over on FanDuel. There's only $100 separating Henry and McCaffrey. We look over on the running back pricing here on FanDuel. You see McCaffrey in my lowest lineup here, $8,900. Henry right there, $9,000. So I do think you can probably justify getting up to Henry there over on FanDuel, but on DraftKings, pretty clear to me, these are the 3 guys that we want. Now, unlike last week, because the NFL takes all their marquee quarterbacks and puts them in island games and primetime situations, we have a ton of the star quarterbacks available here in week 2 on the main slate. That's the guys you see right here on the salary table. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, Patrick Mahomes, and Lamar Jackson, who is in my lineup right now here on the screen and is probably going to be the most popular quarterback for low-risk lineups this week. I do think this is basically a week where we pay up at the quarterback position for one of these elite guys in general, and it does seem like the field is going to gravitate towards Jackson here for low risk, with Baltimore favored by 12.5, with Baltimore having the highest implied team total on this slate of around 29 points right now. Great matchup for Lamar Jackson here. And one of the things that I like to consider when I'm looking at quarterbacks to play in fantasy football, in DFS, is pass blocking and the matchup with the defense. Lamar Jackson had a top 5 pass blocking offensive line last year, and the Browns were a well below average pass defense. That's a recipe for fantasy success for quarterbacks. Plus, we have Lamar Jackson's rushing upside. I think it's pretty clear here that we want to get Lamar Jackson into our low-risk lineups at this price of $7,000 on DraftKings and $8,500 over on FanDuel. Jackson's $300 cheaper than Josh Allen here on FanDuel, which is why that makes him a slightly better play to me there. And they're only $100 apart here on DraftKings, but the tiebreaker for me being Baltimore having the highest implied team total makes complete sense in my book. You're going to see the field consider Burrow and the aforementioned Josh Allen the next most behind Lamar Jackson this week, and that's purely because of the matchup and the upside. Cincinnati, sticking with Burrow, has the second highest implied team total this week at 26.5 points, facing a Jacksonville defense that was the worst pass defense in the league last year. Looked a little bit better last week, but that's a one-game sample. It remains to be seen how that's going to hold up here. We'll continue to use the larger sample data for the next couple of weeks here on this channel. Josh Allen is awesome, right? Like, clearly has an extremely high ceiling, 41 fantasy points last week, a couple of rushing touchdowns, a bunch of passing yardage in the fourth quarter, especially in a huge comeback win against the Baltimore Ravens. So I do think Josh Allen is an awesome play for all lineup types here, but especially tournaments, because we know that he is able to push the ball downfield and really make amazing things happen when required. In a division matchup here with the Jets, I do think he'll be pushing to have a pretty big day as well, to try to basically get out to a fast start here in the AFC East and build a 2-game lead pretty much immediately over all of his opponents if things go as expected in betting markets this week. In the AFC East, Allen is facing a Jets defense that was bottom 5 in the league defending the pass, and said Lamar Jackson had a top 5 pass blocking offensive line. Josh Allen, not only did he have a top 5 pass blocking offensive line last year, he had the best pass blocking offensive line. So do think he does end up slightly less popular than Lamar Jackson in low-risk contests this week, but I'm not going to laugh at or sneeze at anybody that chooses to play Allen over Jackson this week, because they're both in good spots, and Allen might have a little bit of a higher ceiling. So like I said, I do understand it here. Jets also below average defending the rush, and we know Josh Allen is going to call number 17, his own number, quite a few times here as well. Let's talk about some of the pass catchers, though, that we want to use in low-risk contests. I want to start at the tight end position. Posted a short on this channel earlier today. It was Brian and I doing a best ball draft over the summer where we talked about Harold Fandon Jr. and how Cleveland had some plans to use 12 personnel and deploy him fairly liberally with the starters, but got pretty limited usage in preseason, which is always usually a strong indicator of a strong role coming in the regular season. We look at how Cleveland deployed their players last week. Fandon had the second most routes run at tight end, but he ran 31 routes last week. Njoku ran 41. Fandon had 9 targets versus just 5 for Njoku. Fandon was targeted on 29% of his routes run last week, and he's priced at just $3,100 here on DraftKings, $5,000 over on FanDuel. That's a big reason why, at least on DraftKings at that low price, he's actually going to be, we think, the most popular play in tournaments and in low-risk lineups at that cost here. Browns are going to deploy 12 personnel. That means 2 tight ends, 2 wide receivers, the vast majority of the time in their passing game. Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman each ran 46 routes last week at wide receiver, and it was Njoku and Fandon right behind them the next most. So very high floor for playing time, and we need to be on the field to produce. Fandon with 13.6 fantasy points on a 9-target day last week with a designed rush as well. The high touch floor, pretty clear here for Harold Fandon Jr. So when we're looking for value to get the 3 running backs we want, an expensive quarterback in our lineups, we're naturally going to gravitate towards the value opportunity at tight end. And this week, Harold Fandon Jr. does appear to be the best option here on DraftKings. Now, another couple of value plays that I think the field is well aware of at this point, but are also extremely good options to consider. Juwan Johnson with the New Orleans Saints. is also significantly underpriced for his really, really strong role in New Orleans offense. When we look at how the Saints deployed Juwan Johnson last week, he ran the most routes on the team with 47 routes. He had 11 targets last week against the Arizona Cardinals per PFF, 12 here per DraftKings. That's also really, really strong. Targeted on 23% of his routes run. So expecting Johnson to also catch a little bit of ownership, but because he's a little bit more expensive than Harold Fannin, I don't think he will be nearly as popular. They're the exact same price at $5,000 over on FanDuel. So you may see them be a little bit closer on the FanDuel side of things, but I personally do prefer Fannin to Johnson in this spot. And then there's one more player who's not necessarily in the same like bottom of the barrel pricing tier as Fannin and Johnson here, but let's introduce the channel to rookie tight end Tyler Warren with the Indianapolis Colts. Big day against Miami in week number 1. Was targeted on 37.5% of his routes run, ran 24 routes last week for Indianapolis, and think he might actually end up being a featured weapon in this offense pretty much week in and week out. And a big reason why Josh Downs didn't really meet our expectation last week out of the slot is a lot of those looks, I think, went to Tyler Warren instead. It does seem like Daniel Jones and Tyler Warren have a pretty good rapport going on here. And it does seem specifically here in week number 2 with Indianapolis facing the Denver Broncos that they may try to use Warren a little bit more in the passing game to use some of those underneath safer routes than some of those deeper routes with Pittman and Alec Pierce here. So I do think Tyler Warren, 4,500 here on DraftKings, 5,500 over on FanDuel. In that kind of mid-range price tier, also a strong option for all lineup types. Probably more tournaments than low risk, because I do think low risk with the cheap guys, you're going to see the two I talked about catch a little bit more ownership than Tyler Warren. And then finally, the old wily veteran here, Travis Kelce, $5,000 here on DraftKings. Kelce is facing the Philadelphia Eagles in a Super Bowl rematch here in week number 2 at home for the Chiefs. It's a tough spot, but we actually have him projected to be the most popular player at the position. So it does seem like the field is either paying all the way down or just clicking on Travis Kelce right here in the middle of the salary range in low-risk contests. He's $5,000 here on DraftKings and $6,200 over on FanDuel. Was only targeted on 8% of his routes last week, but we're looking at the Chiefs deploying a pretty low-budget wide receiver core with Xavier Worthy most likely sitting this week, and Travis Kelce probably the natural place. People will look for opportunities in their lineups as a result here. Now, we need some receivers. That's a lot of tight end options, and we only have $46.75 per player remaining without having slotted any receivers into our low-risk lineup here, paying up at quarterback. How are we going to make this work? Well, the first place the field is going to go, Hollywood Brown had 16 targets last week for the Chiefs against the Chargers in their week 1 opening loss. Hollywood Brown ran 46 routes, by far the most on the Chiefs. And with Xavier Worthy not expected to play, we do think that Brown is going to basically be the number 1 weapon in this offense for the foreseeable future, at least until Rashee Rice returns from his suspension. Number 1 weapon at wide receiver anyway. Ran 50% of his routes from slot positions, so he is going to line up all over the field. Has that upside of seeing deep targets downfield, had nearly 100 air yards last week on those 16 targets. Brown, just a massive amount of opportunities in week number 1 against the Chargers. And now, once again, we have the Chiefs projected to be playing in a slightly trailing game script here. So we do think Mahomes will be dropping back to pass, trying to push the ball downfield, and Hollywood Brown probably set to benefit from that the most here in week number 2. And I do think he'll be one of the most popular plays at the position for that reason. We do think the field will be paying up for Jamar Chase with his 9-10 plus target upside, for Puka Nacua for his 9-10 plus target upside. But in this particular build, it might be difficult to get to these guys. So there's another cheap receiver that I think will be fairly popular, and that's going to be Calvin Ridley with the Tennessee Titans, who was one of my low-owned plays last week. Didn't really get the box score result that we wanted, but the usage was incredible. 8 targets for Ridley last week, facing a Rams defense here that was below average defending the pass last year, specifically below average against wide receiver ones as well. That all spells a really good opportunity for Ridley to produce here at just $4,900 here on DraftKings. Looking at Tennessee's usage last week. Ridley ran 32 routes, which was the most for the Titans in week number 1. It's 4,900 here on DraftKings, 5,600 over on FanDuel, and he's projected to be one of the most popular wide receivers on the slate because the combination of his opportunity and his upside at this price just seems extremely, extremely undervalued, and the field is going to take advantage of that here. That leaves us 4,300 for a final wide receiver in low risk. We're going to be able to bump that up a little bit by looking at the defenses that the field is going to play. People may pay all the way down with the Browns as well, just to kind of jam in all the best plays. So really think that there's no one true path that you can consider here at defense, but I do think the Steelers are probably who I will deploy, with that being a low total game as well, and the Pittsburgh Steelers favored. Pretty similar approach to last week. I know it didn't necessarily work out because the Steelers and the Jets game shot out, but I do think this is probably the best place to go in low risk, and it gets us 5,500 left. You can get yourself a few more dollars if you come down a few hundred more on defense, play someone a little cheaper, but I do think there's a lot of wide receivers in this range that definitely makes sense for low risk. Probably looking at guys like Ricky Pearsall, Tep McMillan. Those are probably going to be your most popular options. Shakir with the Bills, with Buffalo in a really solid matchup here. So plenty of ways to finish up your low risk lineup here on DraftKings. And then over on FanDuel, because the salary is a little bit looser, you can fit all the guys that I just talked about. The Arizona Cardinals, favored by 6.5, are actually way too cheap at $3,900 on DraftKings. So I think it's a great low risk play here. And with 5,600 left on this build, I mentioned a wide receiver that's going to be popular over on DraftKings that fits for that price. It's Calvin Ridley. We can get to Zay Flowers and have a stack partner with Lamar Jackson in our low risk lineup here on FanDuel. So personally, I think this is how I'm playing it over on FanDuel as well. Okay, time for everybody's favorite part of the show, where we talk about tournaments and things that we want to do as far as stacking is concerned. I think, obviously, with the highest implied team total, you're going to see the field consider, basically this is like a modified cash lineup on DraftKings, basically was what I had for FanDuel low risk. You got these 2-1s with Jackson Flowers and Fannin. You could probably get Derrick Henry in here as well if you think he has some upside. I think that's one of my favorite stacks this week. I am extremely interested in Josh Allen. I think he has the highest ceiling at the quarterback position, as evidenced by last week's performance. And any of these receivers, wanted to have a pretty decent discussion here, can be justified in lineups. I think you can run Josh Allen double stacks, single stacks this week, and not necessarily worry about salary whatsoever, while getting some of the lower plays at running back around it. For example, Keon Coleman, 11 targets last week, 140 air yards, ran the most routes last week with 50. Khalil Shakir, 46 routes. Josh Palmer, 40 routes. Those guys had 9 targets each. Each of these guys had extremely, extremely strong upside, a lot of opportunities to touch the football. Josh Palmer especially was targeted the most per route run. He was targeted on 22.5 of his routes, and he's the cheapest one here, had over 100 air yards. So for me, if I'm picking one of Shakir, Coleman, and Palmer for a Josh Allen like 2-0 or 2-1 stack, Palmer's actually my favorite of the bunch here. Keon Coleman had the strongest role, and I think he's clearly the wide receiver 1 here. I do think Palmer's the wide receiver 2, running outside routes. But just for the salary savings at 4,400, I think Palmer's pretty interesting this week. And then Shakir, the most expensive wide receiver here, definitely the slot receiver for the Bills, ran 84% of his routes out of the slot per PFF. So I do think Palmer is where I will personally go for a Josh Allen stack this week, but any of these 3 guys definitely make a ton of sense. And at tight end, you can consider Kincaid and Knox as well, and that might be how you get to your Josh Allen double stack. A lot of different ways to stack the Bills here, and I think you can just key around Garrett Wilson at receiver, and if you really want him, after a strong game last week, Breece Hall at running back. So Josh Allen stacks with these clear bringbacks on the New York Jets side is my favorite way, I think, to play this slate in high-risk contests. We can get our popular running backs around that. For low risk, that's going to be Chase Brown, Devin Achane, and Christian McCaffrey. We can still get a cheap Harold Fannin in here. And there's plenty of salary to make this work with the defense, cheap wide receivers that I've talked about to this point. So for me, Buffalo stacks, that's what I'm trying to do this week in high-risk contests. But I got a lot of different options for high-risk contests for stacks in the Daily Plug, available at OccupyFantasy.com. for subscribers. Link to that is in the description of the video below here, so make sure you check that out. And if you're not a member, we would certainly appreciate you subscribing to the website to get access to our daily plug, which is the full written breakdown of how to attack every slate in low and high risk contests. We have some air yard data to talk about after 1 week. Not necessarily predictive just yet because it's only a 1 week sample, but I am extremely interested in some plays that I think are going to be very undervalued this week. Last week, I made a call for a under 5% wide receiver that I thought was good, and it was Ridley. It didn't necessarily work out, but we're going to do that every single week. I'm going to pick a low-owned wide receiver that I think has an opportunity to outperform his price every single week in DFS. And I'm going to give you my favorite and then a couple of other options as well. This is a receiver who had 133 air yards last week on 7 targets. He just had 13 receiving yards and was targeted on 25% of his routes run. He's only $3,200 on DraftKings and he's $4,800 on FanDuel. Does that sound like a player that you want to get into your lineups this week? I hope it does, because I'm going to tell you that his Tennessee Titan wide receiver 2, Alec Aoman, 2 receptions for 13 yards, definitely disgusting 3.3 PPR points, but when you go back and you look at the usage that I just described, and if you watched any of this game on Sunday afternoon, you saw that Aoman was targeted heavily by Cam Ward, and I think he will continue to be targeted heavily by Cam Ward. So if I'm picking one specific receiver that's going to be low-owned and cheap this week, that's my favorite play for high-risk large field tournaments. Aoman is firmly on the list for me. Kayshon Boutte operated as the wide receiver 1 for the Patriots last week. 8 targets, 6 receptions, 103 yards, and he is still far too cheap at $4,500 on DraftKings, $5,500 over on FanDuel. And we project him to be just 2% owned in this game on the road against the Miami Dolphins, where the Patriots, once again, are probably going to be looking to throw the ball a lot as underdogs. So I think Boutte is a great play as well, under 5%. 2 receivers that I think are great plays for large field tournaments this week that had the upside last week. Boutte, 140 air yards, definitely met his opportunity far more than Aoman did, but still a great play nonetheless at low cost. These 2 guys, my flag plant, cheap wide receivers, I think are great for lineups this week. Who are you guys interested in for cheap wide receivers? Let's leave some comments under the video here, and myself, Brian, will be moderating those, and we'll give you some answers on how we feel about some of the low-owned plays that you guys think are going to be great for high-risk tournaments this week. That is going to do it for me this week, guys. Good luck in week number 2 of the NFL season. I will be back next week to talk to you about week 3.